All right, welcome. I'm gonna go ahead and get started to episode 10 of kind of the Safety First podcast here, or pod class. I think I've changed this a little bit. Um, Seems like everybody's doing a podcast now. I guess if you want to call this or a newsletter, it's more of say a pod class, uh, teaching people kind of safety 101, different topics, right? So specifically of this episode or this topic is going to be kind of what to inspect, how often, inspect what you expect, kind of deals some common questions that I get, and again, we can open this up to discussions at a later time, but and maybe ideally jump into this a little bit more detailed oriented than what I'm going to do today with each one of these topics, because it's definitely each one of these are important, especially from a compliance standpoint, um, but also from just a workplace safety and morale standpoint as well. So I don't have really anything to share. I already kind of have stuff wrote out. I'm just going to kind of use as reference notes. I don't have any you know good videos or presentations really to share besides generally um, inspection items that are kind of required or best practices. So again, we're going to inspect, work in inspections, the workplace that every workplace should be aware of based on guidelines from EPA, OSHA, NFPA. Right, that's kind of our focus. Right, OSHA, EPA, and maybe some fire safety related with NFPA is definitely a big piece when it comes to this. So first up, workplace safety, ensuring that we're got a safe working environment is definitely, crucial. And OSHA has several specific standards around that piece. But again, from an inspection standpoint, what do we need to look at, right? So we got general work conditions. It's probably number one that I would start off with. Again, I could probably go into a little more depth and bore you with the standard, but right, it's 29 CFR 191022. Kind of workplaces should be inspected monthly for cleanliness, lighting, ventilation, floor aisles, um, good condition, housekeeping, work conditions, generally overall stuff that we typically do and get compiled and get tracked in different avenues than just a strict inspection sheet, right? It could be items listed on a 6S inspection, just our daily checklists for your work area kind of encompasses those things. Machinery and equipment safety. Again, those are kind of quarterly checks we should be doing, whether it's through maintenance, through our operators, checking guards, emergency stops, maintenance of records, all that gets looked at. There's some different, standards where that may apply loosely, right? So one thing about OSHA is if you have a workplace safety concern and condition and they don't have a specific standard to cite on, they can cite it under the general duty clause, which is kind of an all-encompassing clause they can cite to say, hey, you have an unsafe condition or workplace issue that needs addressed. Yeah, we don't have a specific standard on it because, and it literally takes an act of Congress to get something added or taken away or modified when it comes to the Code of Federal Regulations, right? So, electrical safety, not NFPR, but 29 CFR 1910-305, annual inspection and wiring methods, components, and equipment, right? So that's another workplace piece. Ergonomics, PPE, fall protection. So I really kind of highlighted this mainly from a PPE standpoint, right? Because there's always questions on, okay, my hard hat, when does it go bad? When does my fall harness go bad? What about my safety glasses? X, Y, and Z, which are all good, adequate questions, right? And typically the rule of thumb is, if you have any kind of signs of damage, decay, wear, abrasions on any of your PPE, it's best to just discard that and purchase additional PPE. Right, when it comes to like actual documented inspections fitting the standard, right? Usually it's a monthly inspection, and that's not really necessarily always have to be documented, but it's just a visual inspection each time before you use, and then an inspection monthly that maybe or maybe not been documented. I know fall protections from a standpoint, a documented quarterly inspection of your fall arrest systems, whether it be personal fall arrest systems is most generally what you're referring to, your lanyard, um, your harness, um, lifeline, right? Typically, it's self-absorbing or self-retracting SRL or personal fall limiter that you're inspecting on a quarterly basis, right? A documented quarterly inspection. Um, it's best to try to keep these all on track in a shared location. These records, or at least document or spreadsheet somewhere where we have them inspected and checked. I've had third-party assessments come in, whether it's from a Fastenal or a Motion or something like that, come in and do these inspections and help maintain records. That's always preferred to use some kind of third party to maintain a lot of these fall protection and TP related inspection pieces. So fall protection is always important. Your hoisting equipment's one, two, right? Monthly inspections should be done, monthly visuals, right? That's done by the operators. Typically we do in like an annual documented inspection on your slings, chains, hoisting mechanisms, right? And typically, what those do is they get tagged with a date for visual piece too. A lot of times you can do this in different avenues. You can put a date on it. You can color coordinate it as long as that color coordination is communicated to highlight that that's been inspected for this year. You're good to go. You can do that with a lot of your stuff, especially when it comes to fall protection or any kind of hoisting equipment, right? So from a workplace standpoint, you move into some other standards when it comes to, maybe some workplace. That would be hazard communication, right? Labeling SDS sheets and training, right? So the standard, which is a common standard when it comes to hazard communication, is 1910, 1200. Hazard chemical labeling should be inspected monthly, ensuring labels on containers, labels and pipes are clear and legible, right? So that should be a typical thing that we do get checked. Um, Again, who checks this? How often? Who's documenting that? Right. Usually, that's some of that stuff's done through the facility avenue more than the safety avenue. SDS sheets, though, definitely have to be followed up on. And if new SDS sheets get implemented in the work environment, we need to add those to where we store those, which some of us use online databases. Some of us have hard copies and hard books out in the manufacturing area. I know a lot of people use like a 3E online or an MSDS online when it comes to maintaining and managing those SDS documents. Just got to be accessible and available, right? That kind of meets that standard. Emergency preparedness. Emergency preparedness. Again, this fits a good standard too. Monthly inspections of your exit routes, signage, and lighting. Kind of roll this up with emergency lighting, right? So emergency lighting, kind of something that maybe NFPA kind of tags on a little bit here too. But that's a monthly inspection of your emergency lighting that ensures the battery are charged, the bulbs are in good condition, and they're proper placement. And there's an annual 90-minute burn that they do on those. And I say burn because usage have to actually hold it on for 90 minutes. Now they have better technology where they can kind of test the battery and the components without taping the on switch on for 90 minutes to make sure it stays lit and you have enough juice. They can kind of, asphyxiate a meter up there and be able to tell that you're adequate for that from emergency lighting standpoint and exit lighting standpoint. Fire extinguishers, again, another OSHA standard and NFPA standard kind of combine. Again, NFPA is a consensus standard. It's not law, but OSHA can cite consensus standards if they would have an inspection under the general duty clause, right? So 1910-157 would be fire extinguishers. Got to be visually inspected monthly, checking for placement condition, check your pressure gauges if they have a pressure gauge. You're not going to have a pressure gauge on a CO2 extinguisher. What they do with that is they actually weigh it to make sure it hasn't leaked, and then they put it back. And then they do an annual. They do an annual inspection, do an annual maintenance inspection, and then they check the hydrostatic test date. And some of those, typically it's 10-year. I could be off, 7 to 10 year Again, I don't know NFPA standard by heart, but again, OSHA just specifically says, hey, you got to check them monthly, right? So NFPA goes in a little bit more deeper detail on that. Emergency action plans, again, kind of following this emergency preparedness section would be, annual um, annual inspections, emergency action plans are required. So, annual drills. Again, we don't think about that as inspections, but your tornado drills, your fire drills. Again, I don't want to cross over a little bit in NFPA yet, but your fire alarms, sprinkler systems, ammonia detection, whatever you might have, right? That's typically things that you cover in that. But from a plan standpoint, a drill standpoint, annually reviewed. Any plans that you may have, emergency showers and eye wash stations. So again, emergency use, emergency preparedness, still following along with this line, this trend on this topic. Is a question I get asked too. Um, they should be checked. OSHA says monthly. I know ANSI recommends weekly checks. Um, I suggest weekly. You flow it. Check for cleanliness. Make sure you have ambient temperature, right? NFPA, or not NFPA, but the ANSI standards a little bit more in depth on their requirements. And again, other consistent standards, but from an OSHA perspective, right? 1910-151, Section C covers emergency shower usage. And again, monthly is kind of what typically we do. We are looking at getting a lot of locations back up to weekly, but typically a weekly flow, monthly maintenance check is what you need for emergency eye wash showers, and that even calls for like your portable units too. You might as well check those, especially from a cleanliness standpoint and expiration date of the fluid that is in there, because a lot of those are maybe an annual 6 month deal. It could definitely vary on who's managing those, whether you're doing that internally or you're having a third party manage that, like a Centos. As an example. AEDs is another thing that you need to look at. AEDs kind of get overlooked, but have this typically the same person that is in inspecting your first aid kits on a monthly basis, flowing your showers on a weekly basis, checking your extinguishers on a monthly basis, can also check your AEDs. Might as well, right? If you don't have the maintenance personnel to do that internally, you have somebody else do that for you from a compliance standpoint. It's fantastic. Gives you a good report. You got any deficiencies, it gets addressed on the report, and then you can address it either with them or external source or internal source to get that addressed. So AEDs is a monthly inspection. Check the battery life. You check your pads, right? The pads actually have a life expiration date and a life date on them. And of course, accessibility. Key. Accessibility is probably the biggest thing that I've ever seen when it comes to some of these inspections that you see that you have to fix is accessibility. Someone puts something in front of an extinguisher, an eye wash station, right, in front of an exit. Those are all life-saving codes. You don't want to do that, right? So eye wash stations, depending on where you're working at from a chemical standpoint, you got the eye wash station. You need an unimpeded route to get you to the eye wash station within 10 seconds is the rule from ANSI. So um, again, the next thing I kind of want to move on here and check my notes here is health programs. I know it does roll into emergency preparedness here a little bit, but with your health programs, you have your first aid kits. And again, that's within OSHA standard 2, 1910-151, which I believe, let me check my notes. Nope, we haven't covered that one yet, but I thought it was 157 extinguishers. But 151, there's obviously I wrote some of this stuff down. I don't know all this by heart. I know some of them by heart, right? Respiratory protection, 134. I've cited that several times, and of course, noise is the next one. But first aid kits, monthly. Sure, we have components that are complete, right? Stock items that's been used. Check your defibrillator, not necessarily your defibrillator, but your one-way breather masks, anything else from a requirement standpoint that we have guidance on from ANSI and OSHA on what needs to be in a first aid kit. Noise levels typically are an annual update, especially if there's maybe even some kind of changes in the work environment. If things haven't changed, it's typically an easy annual inspection to check to make sure noise levels throughout our facilities are still the same. Now, obviously, if you have changes with our management change process and we've added a machine or taken a machine out, that's going to change noise levels in the environment, and we should update our area assessment. Um, as well, noise levels, if you fit in that hearing conservation program of doing a hearing test, it's kind of an annual audiogram that's required if you meet that threshold to be implemented into a hearing conservation program, right? So you got to be exposed to noise levels of 85 dBA or greater in an 8-hour workday. It's a time weighted average. So you could be exposed to 120 decibels for an hour and then 60 decibels for the rest of the day. You may not meet that threshold to be in that time weighted average for that hearing conservation program. So again, that's something that you could go down a rabbit hole and spend a whole topic of discussion on. And then lastly is respiratory protection, annual inspection and respiratory program. Check respirators. Again, respirators should be checked just like PPE each time before use, but documented on an annual basis. If you have emergency respirators, make sure those are being inspected minimally annually, preferably monthly, especially if it's a high risk environment. Maybe it's an ammonia emergency respirator, a PAPR, purified air, or a powered air purifying respirator, right, which is typically the best to use because it's not a negative pressure respirator, a tight fitting respirator, and a lot of times you don't need an annual fit test for that respirator. Of course, there's other things if you're going to wear a tight fitting respirator from a medical clearance standpoint that you have to go into. But again, you can spend a lot more time going down that rabbit hole. But again, that's something just to be mindful. So that's kind of the gist from a guidance standpoint, from an OSHA perspective, from a workplace perspective. Now, if we move on to maybe an EPA standpoint, again, Environmental Protection Agency and those guidelines, right? Specifically in the U.S. here, what do we look at? We look at air, water, waste. Typically, what you're looking at, maybe even chemical storage, right? That's the big components that we look at. So we have any air contaminants, we have potential for water contaminants, whether that's wastewater or stormwater. And then are we storing chemicals? Are they stored properly? Stored safely? We have any issues for any kind of spillage? And then, waste management. We recycling. We throwing things away properly. We reusing, recycling, disposing in landfill if we have to. What do we need to do? So from an air permit standpoint, right, checking emission sources, control equipment, and obviously records. Ventilation systems are annually inspected for compliance within the NFPA guideline, depending on what your guideline is based off your permit, whether you're a Title V permit or a non-TV permit. I've had both in my lifetime. You're checking magna helix, you're checking all sorts of meters, checking to make sure you don't have any visible dust emissions, etc. Right? If you have an air handler unit, like a unit off of a bead room or something, right? The amount of emissions and how much that runs is negligible, but you still want to make sure you know any kind of emissions that may leak through, right, from a non-TV standpoint. And then, of course, air permits are reviewed annually. Emission reports are usually annually, and compliance statuses are depending on what your permit may be. Wastewater and water permits the same way, right? Wastewater, our quarterly inspections are needed. Sometimes they're more. It's usually at the point of discharge points within the treatment systems, if that's something you have. If you have an on-site treatment system, or you have a maybe it's a wastewater treatment system, but it's pre-treatment systems before it goes to the actual treatment plant for the city. But a lot of those permits are, within the EPA guidelines, but you're dealing with your local municipalities for that wastewater management and what you want to inspect, right? So if you got chances of, depending on what your industry is, you're sampling for oil and grease, dissolvable solids, any line of effect that I've done before. And I've been the guy before that went to the discharge point, filled the samples up, and sent it off to the lab to be inspected. And then of course you get your report back, and you have to be in a certain criteria. If you're out of that, then you get a notice of violation. You get so many notice of violations. Um, you get fined. You need to address that. So, waste management, with RECRA, monthly inspections. If you have any storage areas, which we do, waste oil is probably the biggest one. Used oil, making sure that those are dedicated storage areas. They're labeled, and we have disposal records and manifests for anything that we get rid of, whether it's um, universal waste like waste oil or your batteries or your bulbs, to hazardous waste manifests, etc., and making sure we're using a preferred vendor for that, a Safety Clean or a Crystal Clean, to manage that and help us manage that and dispose of that safely and accordingly. It's kind of what most places do, what we typically do when it comes to waste management. Chemical storage too, quarterly inspections of secondary containments if that's what you need, and spill kits are necessary. So making sure that the maintenance crews are going around checking secondary containments, whether they're dikes, whether they're berms, whether they're concreted secondary storages, making sure that they're adequate, right? Are they capable of holding 110% of the largest container of that area, right? Well, that's one thing you got to look at. EPA guidelines is something that I don't always spend a lot of my time in, and I have to kind of refresh myself if I get back down into that avenue. But it's important. Of course, Right to Know Act too. So we do, from a chemical response standpoint, we do submit tier two reporting, and um, we do have a lot of places, if they have used oil of excess. Um, right now, I can't think of how much you need, but if excessive, I think maybe it's 10,000 pounds used oil, um, or oil in general. You need a SPCC plan, spill containment and countermeasures plan. Of course, that's annually reviewed. Same way with stormwater. With your Safe Drinking Water Act, those regulations, right? We ensure compliance, and we have a SW3P plan, especially if you store stuff outside and not under a shelter, and it has chances of things getting rained on. Rainwater is important. Going to storm drains. Storm drains lead to riverways. Riverways leads to bigger, largest bodies of water, and you don't want to pollute those bodies of water. So you got to make sure that we do check based off your permit quarterly, typically, there's storm drains as well. So that's kind of stormwater management here. Quarterly inspections with compliance of 40 CFR Part 122. Of course, we log that and monitor that. A lot of our maintenance guys do that, but it could be you're actually sampling. Um, we either sample from a wastewater standpoint or a stormwater standpoint. I've done both, but from your stormwater standpoint, you're looking at a lot of criteria as well, whether it's dissolvable solids, oil and grease, um, whatever it might be, anything that you're going to do it. But sometimes you got a little bit less stringent regulations depending on what your industry's in, and it could be a visual sample, it could actually be a sample we have to send to a lab and get those readings kind of quantified on a sheet. So if I haven't totally bored you yet, we'll bust through NFPA guidelines. This is more of my expertise, from my background from working in agribusiness and corn mills and grain mills and soybean plants, and you're dealing with combustible dusts and a lot of air handling units and just fire guidelines in particular. Fire prevention, fire detection systems, according to NFPA 72, a monthly inspection of your alarms, batteries, test records are required, right? So you can do that in a number of ways. I know some people get their sprinkler systems inspected on a quarterly basis, or a monthly basis. Typically, it's quarterly basis. During that time, they'll trip an alarm, make sure you're getting the alarms right, whether it's a silent alarm or not, and they're checking the batteries and the test records, and all that's been documented. Flammable materials, if you have any flammable materials, they fit in the criteria at NFPA 30, right? You got your flammable materials, whether it's, gasoline, whether it's diesel storage, hexane, alcohol, whatever it might be. It's, quarterly inspections of those storage areas, containers, and labeling is necessary. Of course, housekeeping's always a must, and fitting into that monthly inspection piece. Fire protection systems in itself, when you talk about alarms, sprinklers, and extinguishers, we talked a little bit about extinguishers with their monthly inspection requirement within OSHA, but also NFPA 10. And of course, sprinkler inspections can be more than quarterly, but no less than quarterly, right? It can be monthly if you wanted to. I know some places that do a monthly, just because that's kind of been the the um, the standard practice, but you don't have to maintain that. But quarterly is fine within NFPA 13. You're checking the function of your sprinkler heads, typically your piping, your water supply systems. You can go into and you can talk more about like backflow um, preventers and those inspections on an annual basis, and some other things you can kind of go down to. But from a fire protection safety, it's sprinklers, extinguishers. You can get in the fire hoses. A lot of places take fire hoses out because they don't want to inspect them to the level that they need to be inspected and rolled all the way out and stamped and hydro tested and all that stuff. So a lot of places don't even have fire hoses anymore. They got standpipes for fire department connections and all that stuff, though. And then fire alarms, monthly inspection, your fire alarms, like I said, that kind of all fits in there. Electrical safety. Electrical safety is another big one that get talked on a lot, and that kind of fits in NFPA 70, NFPA 70, and NFPA 70E when you talk about arc flash protection, arc flash analysis. But from an NFPA 70 National Electrical Code standpoint, annual inspections of electrical insulators, wiring, and equipment are required. And of course, from an arc flash standpoint, PPE typically inspected before each use and then annually. Check the conditions of the suits, gloves, hoods, shields, all that stuff. Your gloves, your electrical insulated gloves, got to be inspected at least annually. Typically, they get, well, what I've done in past practice is each employee that is a qualified person to work on live electrical has 2 pairs of electrical rated gloves, whether they're class 00 or class 0. Really doesn't matter. It does matter, but depending on the voltage they're working on, it matters. But to me, it doesn't matter, because if it's the same standard, as you got to have at least inspected and documented inspected, every at least annually. You can inspect it and put one into storage for, I think, 6 month period, and pull that back out and kind of have it on a rotation, so you're not without any kind of gloves. But again, there's third party sources that you can utilize to have this done pretty adequately, um, and more cost effective and timely than doing it internal. And of course, arc flash analysis is a review of your wiring equipment, components, breakers, transformers at your location. That's typically every 5 years or as needed, to ensure accuracy that reflects the electrical systems. If there are changes in your electrical systems, you're adding something new on, you're pulling some more energy from somewhere else, different changes that could be added a transformer. You got a new piece of equipment that needs a different service line in, right? That's when you need to update the arc flash analysis. If not, typically every 5 years, or you're at least annually going around doing some IR scanning of your electrical components to make sure that you don't have any hot spots that could lead to, an arc flash, anything like that could, cause some maintenance deficiencies in the future. So I do have a quick summary I will share after this meeting, after this call, that kind of encapsulates all these into a good little spreadsheet of how often, how much, what's the gist, right? I think there's maybe 13 items we kind of briefly talked about, from from water to workplace to emergency planning to electrical to fire, right? A lot of dates, a lot of standards, where they fit in, and so I will share that out. Um, but for this episode, again, I got to keep it somewhat short to 30 minutes here for today, and I'm running already a little past that time, but that's it. So just remember, overall, ensure compliance with OSHA, EPA, and NFPA standards. Right? If you've got questions on anything when it comes to safety or health in the workplace, utilize your safety resource. Right? Myself, others that you may know, for any kind of information and resources. Right? So I know this is a good little Cliff Notes version of some of the stuff that we see every day. Again, safety's pretty wide range spectrum, but this is a piece of it. But again, regularly inspect and proper maintenance and care of all these items will help, ensure workplace safety and compliance for you and all your employees. Um, and with that, that's all I have. So I appreciate you guys kind of tuning in and paying attention. And we'll see you. We'll see you next time. Thanks.